Hi there, it's Nalani Brown again, picking up on Chapter 8 of Mozart's Starling by Leonda Lynn Hop. It's Chapter 8, Birds of a Feather. In June of 1787, Mozart entered a new composition, Ein musikaler Spaß, or a musical joke, into his catalog of completed works. The first piece he had finished since the death of his father, and then his Starling. The work is now designated K 522, and is an unusual chamber ensemble for 2 French horns, 2 violins, viola, and bass. Mozart's never shied away from complexity, but we know from his words and music that he was always against disharmony. This divertimento is Mozartian anomaly, lurking wildly and unpredictably between keys and sprinkled with discordant accidentals. At the time of its publication, the piece was not given much regard as serious music, and those who paid it any mind believed that it was meant to parody the ineptitude of the current musical establishment, or was perhaps even a spoof of a particular composer. It is rumored that Czech composer Leopold Kozluch actually attacked Mozart on a visit to Prague, convinced that he was the parodied artist. It has been a great sadness to me, and a kind of irony, that Carmen takes almost no interest in Mozart's music. I did, after all, pluck her from the nest and raise her from a scrawny, dying nestling to study a Starling's relationship to the great composer. I wouldn't mind so much if she didn't seem interested in music at all, but she loves almost all other music, all except Mozart's, or most of Mozart's. As I mentioned, she does at least enjoy the final movement of Starr's Concerto, but there is another Mozart composition that she dearly loves, and to me it seems another dimension of Mozart's joke, as if he had reached beyond the grave to play one last trick. This Starling I live with, the supposed kindred spirit of the maestro, sits blithely plucking at her feathers while Mozart's sublime mass in C minor drifts from the stereo speakers. But the much maligned, musically dubious divertimento, the musical joke, Carmen leaps to life like an opera hero. She tilts her head. She looks at me as if something wild is happening, and she expects that I too should recognize it. And if she is truly carried away, she will toss her little head back and sing. After that, she will look at me as if to say, "Was that good?" It's so cute and innocent, it almost breaks my heart. I want to be annoyed, but instead, I give her a kiss on the cheek, which she hates. She fluffs the kiss off. "Very pretty," I tell her. After Mozart's death, when his music was being passed around and played in his honor, musicians were reluctant to perform a musical joke because it made them sound incompetent. Modern musicians are equally unenthusiastic. Some contemporary musicologists agree with the parody theory. Some feel that Wolfgang was working through his relationship with his father, who had died the previous month, though I find it doubtful that he would have treated this subject comically so soon after Leopold's death, or ever. Some think it contains a hidden message not yet understood. Some are convinced that this was an instance in which Mozart simply lost his way and created a superficial piece, lacking in significance. Most just find it unlistenable. Lanier notes from a Deutsche Grammophon recording some of the popular view. In the first movement, we hear the awkward, unproportioned, and illogical piecing together of uninspired material. The andante cantabile contains a grotesque credenza, which goes on far too long and pretentiously ends with a comical deep pizzicato. By the end, the commentator declares, Mozart is writing like an amateur composer who has lost all control of his incongruous mixture. Such pronouncements suggest that the entire piece is a bizarre horror, when in actuality there is much to enjoy. The composition, on the whole, is lighthearted, and there are moments of bright energy and sweetness, especially the triplet-driven opening of the Allegro, a section that makes me want to get up and twirl. If there seems to be a loss of control, as suggested by the Dutch gramophone author, I would argue it is a tightly controlled appearance of disorganization, which a true amateur could never pull off. Even so, Mozart didn't mean for the composition to represent his serious side. It was a playful piece with a riddle at its center. Where did this wild voice come from? The description of this music should sound familiar. I have experimented with playing the most objectionable cadenzas from A Musical Joke alongside the recorded vocalizations of a Starling who has almost lost himself in one of his long, rambling utterances, and with Carmen's own singing. The melodies, or unmelodies, of the quintet excerpts and the Starling songs can be perfectly overlaid. I am not the first to notice the resemblance. When Meredith West and her husband, Andrew King, were pondering the subject of Mozart's Starling while raising Starlings of their own for research, the comparison became irresistible. The pair were students of animal behavior, not musicologists or Mozart historians, and with their fresh ears, they could detect something that centuries of musical commentary had overlooked. A Musical Joke, the researchers asserted in 1990, bears the vocal autograph of the Starling. They noted the fractured phrases, the tendency of Starlings to respond to songs they have heard by singing them back off key, to repeat parts that seem to have gone on long enough, and to delete parts that seem essential to the human ear. One of the birds in West's study loved to mimic part of a song and heard it in the household. Way down upon the swa. That was it. No matter how many times the Starling heard the song, nothing could convince it to add Knee River. On top of all this, Starlings flexibly and unpredictably combine and recombine phrases, just as Mozart does in this piece, while tossing in Starling-esque whistles and squeals. As Meredith West wrote in response to the Dutch gramophone commentator, the illogical piecing together, in keeping with the Starlings, intertwining of the whistled tunes, the awkwardness could be due to the Starling's tendencies to whistle off-key or to fracture musical phrases and unexpected points. The presence of drawn-out, wandering phrases of uncertain structure is characteristic of Starling soliloquies. Finally, the abrupt end, as if the instruments had simply ceased to work. The signature of Starling's written all over it. Revered ornithologist Luis Bapta of the California Academy of Sciences ordained the view. The piece that flummoxed musicologists, claimed Baptista, certainly does mimic the Starling's innate vocal tendencies. He adds to the conversation by noting that the final cadence of the joke is composed in a two-tone counterpoint, a Bachian element, but also a bird-like one. The structure of the syrinx, the avian version of the larynx, allows many songbirds, including starlings, to sing two and sometimes even more notes or tones at the same time, a technique perfected in the flute songs of thrushes. Baptista suggests that the counterpoint is another proof of Starling influence, and I believe him, but I believe too that this cadence also represents the playfully joined voices of composer and bird. As further substantiation of Starr's influence on the sextet, we know that A Musical Joke was composed in bits and pieces during the 3-year period that Mozart lived with Starr, and it was completed soon after the Starling's death. Thus, the piece morphs from musical error into musical eulogy. Mozart's idiosyncratic gift in tribute to the bird whose little life twined so thoroughly with his own. The affinity was an honest one. Bird and composer had much in common. Both Maestro and Starling shared an astonishing likeness in talents. Mimicry, vocal play, musical gymnastics, personality, busyness, stillness, flirtatiousness, tomfoolery, and social priorities, attention-seeking. Like other members of his species, Starr was flirtatious and prone to bursting into song, and Mozart himself, who is said to have wandered eccentrically about, muttering in a musical recitative, a habit both operatic and bird-like. Like Starr, Mozart was a gifted mimic. Certainly he could imitate any musical style in his compositions, and regularly did. He was commissioned to create a particular style of work for church or official occasions throughout his career. But he could, even as a child, also vocally imitate any of the prevailing opera seria styles in ranges from tenor to full soprano. When Mozart bragged in a letter to his father, "I can, as you know, pretty much adopt and imitate any form and style of composition," Leopold replied, "I know your capabilities. You can imitate anything." As a child, Mozart was as wide-eared as a starling, swiftly learning new languages and absorbing musical styles and influences in his travels. And he would forever use modeling, imitation, and parody playfully and generously in his own compositions. Always the impresario, Leopold urged Wolfgang to use this skill to professional advantage, as he did. But Wolfgang also mimicked for fun, and limiting parties with his vocal and physical impressions of friends, other musicians, and even the emperor. He was surely surprised and delighted by the ever-changing, ever-mischievous vocal capacities of his pet, so much like his own. In their shared vocal play, their clever backing and forthing of oral possibility, Mozart found the closest thing to an avian kindred spirit that the green earth had to offer. A bird playmate evolved, it seemed, just for fun. The other day, Claire and I were browsing at Pegasus, our wonderful neighborhood used bookstore. She at the Austin Bronte shelf, and I close by in Willa Cather, when I heard her whisper in teenage horror, "Mom, you have bird poop in your hair." I've lost count of the times she's had to make such proclamations in public, and they never cease to scandalize her. I've come to be rather philosophical about it. What can one do? Carmen sits on my head half the day, so naturally she poops there, and guano in the tresses is tricky business. While Starling excrement wipes easily from a non-porous surface, the best way to get it out of your hair is to pick the solid bits off with tissue paper and let the rest dry, at which point it can easily be combed out. Usually, though, I forget about it and it sort of blends in until the next shampoo. When I spoke with Tim Gentner about his Starling grammar research, the conversation came around to Carmen, and he was intrigued. Though he's worked with hundreds of captive starlings, he's never lived with one flying around his house. The things that usually surprise people about Carmen, that she's pretty, smart, tame, and can talk, are of course well known to Gentner. So I was amused by his question, "Doesn't she make a mess?" By which he really meant, "Isn't there poop all over your house?" Well, yes and no. Like all birds that do a lot of flying, starlings poop a lot. It's adaptive, essential in keeping their weight down for optimal aerodynamics. When a little waste accumulates in their intestines, they poop it right out to stay clean, light, and flight weight. Compare this strategy to a bird like a loon, say, or a cormorant, one that doesn't fly much but dives for a living and needs to be heavy and unbuoyant. These birds accumulate great stores of waste, which they eventually eliminate in shocking streams and that float like rafts on the surface of the water. Seeing them, you might think a whale had passed by. Though starlings defecate more frequently, their droppings are low volume. Most of the bird extera we see on urban and suburban sidewalks come from birds like crows and pigeons, bigger birds with droppings that are substantial enough to stick around for a few hours or a day. But starlings and most other urban songbirds are smaller bodied. Their poops blend with the grass and the dirt, quickly wash away in rain sprinkle, or are otherwise absorbed into the substrate. This is not true, of course, in places where birds gather in numbers, such as colonial nest sites or autumn roosts, where the accumulated waste can be an eyesore and even a human health concern. The issue is more problematic for an indoor bird. Though I allow Carmen to fly freely as much as possible, she still spends a lot of time in her AV area and is there overnight. So that is where most of her droppings accumulate. I make sure that newspapers lining the floor are changed every day and that her perches are scrubbed. As far as the rest of the house goes, recall that starlings are remarkably social. Carmen does not care to be flapping about the house by herself exploring. She wants to be with us, on us. Since I am Carmen's primary caregiver, that's where her poop goes, on me, or at least within arm's reach. I always have a square of tissue in my hand, ready to wipe away any fresh pooplets that drop onto my computer screen or on the floor or the book I'm reading. I have an old shirt, now dubbed the poop shirt, which I pull over the top of whatever I'm wearing when I let Carmen out of her aviary. It's an imperfect system. I often forget to don the poop shirt, and when I take off my clothes and change into my pajamas at night, I discover that I have been wandering about all day in a healthy dollop of Carmen's doo-doo on the back of my sweater. Friends or historians sometimes bring up the fact of random poop as an argument against my firm belief the star was let out to fly freely in Mozart's study. Surely, this would not have been allowed in a decorous 18th century home, even one as eccentric as the Mozarts. But a little starling poop here and there would not have fazed Mozart or his family in the least. Mozart was happily conversant with digestive matters. When Peter Hall, director of the play Amadeus, spoke with Margaret Thatcher after a performance, he was bemused to discover that she was horrified by the maestro's vulgarity of manner as it was portrayed in his production. Evidently, the Prime Minister was not known as a patron of the dramatic arts. The premiere of Amadeus was the first time she had ventured into the theater in some 15 years. And this because she was a fan, not of the theater, but of Mozart. Hall wrote of Thatcher's response to the performance in the introduction of a later edition of Peter Schaffer's play. She was not pleased. In her best headmistress style, she gave me a severe wigging for putting on a play that depicted Mozart as a scatological imp with the love of four-letter words. Thatcher proclaimed it inconceivable that the man wrote such exquisite and elegant music could be so foul-mouthed. But while Amadeus does take many historical liberties, this is not one of them. Hall politely attempted to bring Mrs. Thatcher up to speed on the contents of Mozart's letters, but was told, "I don't think you heard what I said. He couldn't have been like that." And Hall had no choice but to concede. The Prime Minister insisted that I was wrong, so I was. Mozart reveled in toilet humor, a predeclination he came by honestly. Potty talk was a regular part of his upbringing. Naturally, there was the usual playful poo jesting between brother and sister, both at home and in letters while they were apart. But such humor continued long beyond childhood. Mozart's scatological jokes are often tossed off as part and parcel of the poor taste of adolescence, his overall immaturity, or perhaps even a kind of pathology. But excrement was a standard subject of conversation, and joking between the seemingly straight-laced Leopold and the proper Anna Maria as well. When Wolfgang and his mother left for their European tour in 1777, none of the family dreaming that Anna Maria would die in Paris, she assured her fretting husband in a letter along the way, "Don't worry, darling. Everything will come right in the end. I wish you good night. But, my dear, but first, shit in your bed and make it burst." Emphasis, mine. This wording appears also in letters from ostensibly prudish Leopold to his wife and son, from Wolfgang to his first lover, cousin Maria Anna Thekla Mozart, the Basile, or little cousin, as Wolfgang called her, whom he visited in Augsburg. As far as I have been able to determine, this is not a historical idiom, but simply a light-hearted and rather weird family meme. In a letter to Basile, Wolfgang wrote after a parody of other silliness, "Oui, oui, by love of my skin, I shit on your nose so it runs down your chin." And further along, "I now wish you a good night. Shit in your bed with all your might. Sleep with peace on your mind, but try to kiss your own behind." and after pages of linguistic feats displaying a wild wit and questionable taste, the young maestro turned to fart jokes. Now I must relate to you a sad story that happened just this minute. As I'm in the middle of my best writing, I hear a noise in the street. I stop writing, get up, go to the window, and the noise is gone. I sit down again, start writing once more. I have barely written 10 words when I hear the noise again. I rise, but as I rise, I can still hear something but very faint. It smells like something burning. Wherever I go, it stinks. When I look out the window, the smell goes away. When I turn my head back to the room, the smell comes back. Finally, my mama says to me, "I bet you let one go." "I don't think so, Mama." Yes, I'm quite certain." I put it to the test, stick my finger in my ass, then put it to my nose, and esse provatum est. Mama was right. Now farewell. I kiss you 1,000 times. When Constance shared the Basile letters with Franz Niemsteck for his early biography, she wrote an accompanying note. Although in dubious taste, the letters to his cousin are full of wit and deserve mentioning, although they cannot, of course, be published in their entirety. I decidedly disagree with Hall's conclusion in his introduction of Schaffer's play that Mozart had an infantile sense of humor and protected himself from maturity by indulging his childishness. Mozart's scatological bent is part of a wide-ranging wordplay that was bawdy and might have been immature in some ways, but in my view, the response to the entire Mozart family to an essential element of human condition shows acceptance, wit, and a sense of humor that is more indicative of playful intelligence than actual puerility. Subscribers to the sublime Mozart myth are naturally horrified, but in truth, things may not be as bad as they seem. The Mozarts did not live in a whitewashed modern society. There was no water in the homes, no pipe systems, however rudimentary, no toilets of any kind. The fact of the body were close to the surface of everyday life. Nor was 18th century Salzburg the laced-up theater of manners of the coming of Victorian era. There was more room for casual jocularity. And yet, even with such allowances, was the Mozart family's toilet humor what you would say normal? Probably not entirely. This talk is a bit coarse by social standard, and for this reason, it offers a wonderful insight into the family. For 200 years, we have unquestioningly swallowed the preferred image of Leopold as an uptight patriarch at the helm of a rigidly controlled family, and yet in the Mozart's letters, an ephemera and portraits and other image emerges. Here was a family that was intelligent and hardworking and concerned with status and success, yes, but also one that was comfortable together, that was jolly, silly fun, and a bit raucous. All of us grew up visiting the houses of our friends and their parents, where we learned that there were families that made fart jokes and families that did not. The Mozarts were the sort that did. And so, for Mozart, the finger smeller, the shit burster, surely the tiny droppings that issued from Star, quickly wiped up, would have been nothing at all. Mozart composed on good paper, and it would have been easier to clean Star's droppings from his compositions in progress than it is for me to wipe them away from my modern, poor quality copy paper. Fair copies of manuscripts would have been kept away from the bird, just as I kept my beloved old leather diary, my complete Emily Dickinson, and other treasures out of arm's reach when Carmen is in my study. Though they can stay out on the shelves and do not have to be put away completely. As I say, she doesn't venture much from my shoulder. Mozart's ink bottle would have had to be minded, but overall I expect Mozart had it easier with his bird than I do with mine. I'm just waiting for my MacBook Pro to fizzle and short from fresh, liquidy Carmen poo sliding between the keys. When I took it into the shop because it was overheating and the fan was making the thumpa sounds, the tech took it apart and showed me the food that was stuck in the mechanism. Yeah, I confessed. That's actually Starling poop. With no apparent sense of humor at all, he brushed the fan clean and sold me a rubber keyboard cover. Mozart's wordplay was not limited to bodily functions. In the above quoted letter to Basile, Wolfgang takes a flight of astonishingly epistolary Mozart takes a flight of astonishing epistolary fancy. The whole letter becomes a spiel, a play, a playground. It does not convey the kinds of thoughts and details of daily life typically found in a missive between dear young friends or lovers, but for the most part, it is a tumble of internal rhyming, verbal mirroring, echoes, synonyms and puns that defy translation. But calculated nonsense, a sort of Alice in Wonderland letter, never mere blather, but a work of stunning, charming, goofy intelligence, from the greeting, dearest cuz boss, to the sign-off, his usual, I kiss you 1,000 times. As he concluded most every letter he ever wrote to his loved ones, though the number was sometimes 1,000 or 100 or 100,000 or even 1,000,000, to the signature, Old Young Soschfons, Wolfgang Amadee Rosenklaus. There is never a dull moment in his long letter. I have received, reprived your highly esteemed writing, biting, and I have doted that my uncle Gafunkel, my aunt Slant, and you are all well, Mel. We too, thank God, are in good fettle kettle. Today I got the letter from my papa haha safely into my pa's claws. Wolfgang makes fun of Basile's declaration of the affection in a recent letter. You let it out. You expose yourself. You let yourself be heard. You give me notice. You declare yourself. You indicate to me. You bring me the news. You announce unto me. You state in broad daylight. You demand. You desire. You wish. You want. You like. You command that too. I, too, should send you my portrait. But then he gives in with flirtatious nonchalance. Ah, bien, I shall mail fail it for sure. And while Mozart was at his freest in his note to his beloved cousin lover, there is no shortage of linguistic acrobatics in the rest of his correspondence and throughout his life. He slips so swiftly and agilely from his native German to riffs in English, Italian, French, and Latin, and tosses in his rhymes and puns so effortlessly that one could almost miss the fact that anything beyond the usual is going on. His most regular correspondent was his father, Leopold, who would worry and scold and demand news if he did not hear from Wolfgang frequently. Every letter always began with a rhyme, Mon très cher Pierre, and it was signed with, I kiss your hands 1,000 times. He wrote to Nannerl on the occasion of her marriage in 1784, just a few months after Mozart moved with his family to Starling to the Domgasse apartment. Ma très chère sœur, good gracious, it's high time for me to write to you if I want my letter to still reach you as a virgin. A few days later, and it's gone. He sends congratulations and pleasantries and travel plans and concludes with explicit marital advice, which takes a feminist turn in rhyming, rambling, iambic pentameter. So, if your husband shows you cool reserve, which you feel you do not deserve, but he, with knotted brow, thinks he's right, just tell yourself, well, it's his way, and say, yes, master, thy will be done day by day, but my will shall be done at night. In February of 1784, Wolfgang attended a masked ball disguised as an Indian philosopher. He handed out pamphlets filled with clever riddles he had written himself, styled after the works of Iranian philosopher Zoroaster, the model for Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and also probably for Sarastro's in Die Zauberflöte. Wolfgang sent a copy to his father, and you can almost hear Leopold giggling with approval when he sent it along to Nannerl at her home in St. Gilgen. The enclosure I'm sending you came from your brother. I solved the first 7 riddles right away just by reading them, but the 8th is hard. These fragments are good and true. I suppose they are for moral edification. Please let me have the pamphlet back. Beyond all the chattering and wordplay, there is one similarity between Mozart and Starling's that I would never have guessed. It is known that Mozart enjoyed drinking and was prone to tipsiness at parties. I cannot speak for Star, but wine is Carmen's favorite thing in her known world. She'll steal a sip at any chance she can get, and we've discovered that she can even tell a wine glass from other vessels. If we line up a series of empty glasses on the counter, juice glass, water goblet, wine glass, she will fly straight to the wine glass and poke her bill down to the very bottom, seeking her sweet elixir and spreading her wings to keep her balance. If the cupboard is open, even for a second, she zips straight for the wine glass shelf and knocks the flute nearest to the edge to its death on the slate floor. Whenever we need to catch her to clip her toenails or accomplish some other small Starling maintenance task, we just pour a little wine in the bottom of a glass and grab her when she is bill down and tail up. It's too easy. And though after such a stunt on our part, she will attempt to control herself and avoid wine glasses for a couple of days, in the long run, it is too much for her. Her alcoholic tendencies overwhelm her suspicions regarding our motives. Occasionally, I relent and share a little Cabernet from my own glass. Just a bit. It's not good for her. And the last thing I need is a drunken Starling flopping about. I love my vision of Mozart doing the same with Star. Way back when I began exploring this story, I had no doubt that Mozart and his Starling pet would find common ground in their adventurous vocalizing and musicality. But the more I've discovered of Mozart's personality and the more I learn about Starling's by living with Carmen, the more I find the similarities between Mozart and Star to be more extreme than I'd ever dreamed. The unusual cleverness, the playful disobedience, the propensity for almost ceaseless chatter, both were fluttering and curious and disorderly. Both were incapable of being still and quiet in a world so full of sound and happening and beauty. Both shared the impulse to make wild, original, constant music. Beyond a musical joke, no one has suggested further direct connections between Mozart's Starling and a particular piece of music. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any. To the alert listener, I believe the lasting influence of Star on Mozart's work is everywhere in evidence. An infinity of bird-like phrases visits his later work. In areas composed for some of Mozart's rascally opera heroes, there are bouts of Starling-esque mischief. And I do not think it is a simple coincidence that, after Star's death, a character appears in the Mozart canon that charmingly embodies all the shared personality quirks of both maestro and bird. Mozart composed much of his opera, Die Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute, in a tiny cottage set in the rose garden of Salzburg's Mirabell Palace. Windows open to the sounds of birds and the cycles of nature that surfaced in the opera. This is the same garden where the Von Trapp children twirled in the film The Sound of Music, wearing their curtain clothes and singing Do Re Mi. The cottage still stands, but I was distressed to find it closed and padlocked for restoration when I was in Salzburg. I was still able to tiptoe around the cottage edges. After doing a little twirl of my own among the roses, I sat quietly and listened to the garden birds. These are the same species that Mozart heard as he composed European robin, long-tailed tit, chaffinch blackbird. I couldn't help whispering to them, "The souls of your ancestors still fly in the arias of the Magic Flute." Die Zauberflöte's ponderous libretto by Emanuel Schikaneder, with its Masonic overtones and dragging plot, is saved by two things: some of the most soaring operatic arias ever composed, or the comic presence of the character Papageno. Papageno appears in costume, a flurry of feathers. He is a bird catcher by trade, but in person more of an actual bird. In the opening scene, the opera's purported hero, Tamino, faints after being chased by a giant serpent. He is saved by the Queen of the Night's maidens, but when he awakens, only Papageno is there. "What are you?" Tamino wonders, noting Papagino's feathery garb and fiddish demeanor. Me? Papagino is incredulous. I'm a human being like you. He replies with a sidelong glance that leaves us all in doubt. When Tamino credits Papagino for his rescue, the birdcatcher doesn't bother to correct him. The maidens return and punish Papagino for his falsehood by putting a padlock on his mouth, the worst of penances. Throughout the opera, there is a running gag that Papagino cannot keep from chattering. The chatter of Papagino is social, charming, busy, strange, feathery, musically adept, unpredictable, troublesome yet delightful. It is not difficult to see where the inspiration for Papagino arose in Mozart's life. Papagino leaps about, unsure and aflutter, meaning well, getting into all manner of mischief. He is the coyote trickster, if Shakespearean fool, his buffoonery masking his intelligence and capability. Everyone in his raptures over the supposed bravery of handsome Prince Tamino, but it is Papagino, not Tamino, who twice saves the heroine Pamina from being raped, and it is Papagino who finds the voice to join her in a powerful duet that sings love into existence. The librettist, Emanuel Schickander, was a bit of a character. He had run a traveling theater and himself a motley mix of impresario, playwright, player, and rustabout. In 1791, he settled in Vienna to the theater off to Wieden, and in here he renewed his long friendship with Mozart. It was Schickaneder's idea for them to collaborate on his new Singspiel, or play with music. There are more speaking parts in Die Zauberflöte, than in strict operas, where all speaking parts are sung in recitative. Papagino in the initial production, by all accounts, Schickander had I'm so sorry about this one. Schickander had a lively stage presence and doubtless made a wonderful birdcatcher. Mozart kept the aria simple enough for Schickander's range, which was not as extensive as a professional opera singer's. But Papagino's melodies are so lovely, the sentiments so human and true, and the baritone voice so inherently gorgeous that listeners find nothing wanting. Papagino is best loved for two arias, the first solo in which he announces himself as a birdcatcher, and the later ecstatic love duet with his mate, an equally feathery Papagina, during which the pair plan their future flock of little Papaginos and Ginas. Both melodies are light, bouncy, silly, and enchanting, and along with the Queen of the Night's tormented rant, with its famous F above high C, these tunes from Papagino are the opera's zenith. Some musicologists have proposed that in these arias, Mozart is mocking the insipidity of the Viennese musical establishment. Or maybe they are meant to ridicule the compositions of Antonio Salieri, the lesser but at the same time more socially established and respected composer. Or perhaps the figure of Papagino represents Salieri himself, painted as a half-wit. The portrayal of Salieri in Amadeus is entertaining but fictitious. He did not poison Mozart. I have made an effort to give credence to such theories, but in all honesty, it is difficult to believe that anyone knows anything of Mozart and has truly experienced Die Zauberflöte could come to such conclusions. Within the magic flute, one message arises above all the others. Mozart loves Papagino. In one of his early performances, he even surprised Schickander by appearing off stage to play the sound of Papagino's glockenspiel himself. Renowned Seattle opera director Spate Jenkins, now emeritus, wrote an essay for the program of a 2011 production of The Magic Flute entitled Papagino's Magical Humanity. in which he claims that Papageno is the character in this opera with whom the audience can most immediately connect. He wants a good life, enough food to eat, and above all, a good wife. Mozart, from what we know of him, had all the same feelings. He loved his wife Constance, and perhaps his most obvious connection in the libretto to his own feelings is Papageno's wanting Papagena to be his, it's a German word, which means wife of my heart. Weibchen, which was Mozart's pet name for Constance. Dr. Jenkins has directed numerous productions of the Magic Flute and attended countless performances of the opera all over the world. When I asked him over a cup of tea at the Seattle coffee shop recently whether Papageno might represent some kind of derogatory comment by Mozart on the music of his day, Jenkins laughed. "Papageno is Mozart's everyman," he responded. Then he paused and looked at me straight before saying, "Papageno is Mozart." There are many persistent but untrue myths about Mozart. That he was a man-child, always infantile, that he was broke his whole life, that he was buried in a pauper's grave. One of the most enduring is the notion, so commonly repeated in the Mozart scholarship, that he was the most urban of composers, that he was at home only in the city and altogether isolated from the natural world in his life and his work. The misconception may be traceable to a work by Alfred Einstein. No verifiable relation to Albert. The music historian best known for completing the first thorough edit of Mozart's musical catalog, the Köchel catalog, still in use, which lists the works roughly in order of compilation, thus the K, followed by a number that appears on each of Mozart's compositions. In his 1945 book Mozart, His Character, His Work, Einstein proclaimed that the composer had no sympathy for nature. The book was read by an elite audience in its time, but would likely be nothing more than an obscure reference today if not for the fact that Thomas Mann, in the throes of his final illness, chose Einstein's volume as his deathbed reading. In a 1955 letter to his son Michael, the penultimate letter of his life, Mann wrote that he could sit up listening to music for perhaps an hour a day, but even this effort taxed his nerves. He would rather read Einstein's book. He swallowed Einstein's whole and immortalized his untenable ideas with some of the last words that issued from his own pen. What especially interests me is that Mozart has no sense for nature at all, nor for architecture, or Sehenswürdigkeiten, it's a German word again, Sehenswürdigkeiten in general, but found simulation only in music itself, and so to speak, made music out of music, a kind of artistic inbreeding and filtered production. Very curious. The idea that Mozart's music is somehow sourced in music itself is philosophically intriguing, and there is no way to know how genius unfolded in the mysterious process of composition, for which Wolfgang possessed the innate facility. But to make the leap from such musing to the notion that Mozart had no sense for nature is simply unsupportable. Mozart did love the bustle of the city, and he was concerned about the musical matters that came to the fore there, wealth, appearance, and especially acclaim. But even a cursory reading of Mozart's letters and knowledge of his daily activities show that he loved the natural world and turned to wild things to profound inspiration. Like Goethe, he was interested in recent scientific discoveries, and he paid attention to animals, weather, and the workings of the natural world. He accumulated a small gallery of fine bird prints, part of which was recently gathered for a temporary display at Mozart House, and his collection grew to include detailed plant drawings. He loved to be out of the city, to picnic with Constance in wooded places, to wander at length with her partner in her Prater, the three-lined bird-filled park at the edge of Vienna. "I can't make up my mind to go back to the city so early," he wrote to Leopold a day after out with his pregnant little wife. And upon seeing the cottage in the Vienna woods, where he was to be put up for a few days while visiting the chancellor, he exclaimed to his father, "This little house is not much, but the surroundings, the woods, where he had a grotto built that looks as if it had been done by nature herself. All of it is so magnificent and so agreeable." Mozart did not conspicuously gush about his feeling for nature as the Romantics would, but his response was honest and heartfelt. He loved birds, loved animals, loved to ride his horse, loved to walk at the edge of the woods. All of this expressed with joy in his letters and in his music. Poet Gray Snyder wrote that wildness is a quality of one's own consciousness, an elemental characteristic that ran deep in Mozart. He had a way of being, a habit of imagination that belonged in the realm of wildness and nature, regardless of where he lived. It is a quality that, at some level, we all share. Carmen's domestic life is a trade-off. She doesn't have the freedom of a wild bird, but she doesn't have the perils of wildlife to contend with either. Exposure to extreme weather, the vagaries of food availability, competition with other starlings, parasites and diseases that social birds share, predators, and there are other perks to Carmen's life in our household. She's fed homegrown arugula by hand and has eggs hard-boiled just for her. She enjoys in-house cello concerts. She has a laptop and gets to watch Seinfeld Returns. She has a pet cat. With all of this, I sometimes forget Carmen's essential wildness, but then she will do something so completely and weirdly birdish that I'm startled into remembering. Her sun bath is one of these things. On sunny days, I grab a book and plunk myself in a chair by the bright kitchen window for this lazy but necessary Starling health maintenance. Carmen perches on my arm or shoulder where the sun's warmth feels magnified through the window glass. She settles in, spreads her wings, tilts her head, opens her beak, and raises every feather on her body, as if she were a very soft porcupine. Bits of spittle form at edges of her bill. To all the world, she would look extravagantly poisoned. Like many birds, starlings enter a torpor-like state in the sun and spread themselves out so that as much light as possible can reach their epidermis. The many health benefits are believed to include vitamin D absorption, discouraging of parasites, release of oils that protect the skin, and possibly even a mental health advantage, something akin to the restorative calm as we humans feel when we lie on the beach or meditate. Sunning birds look like dying zombies. Their pupils dilate, and they flop sideways on the ground. I cannot count how many times people have called me to describe a supposedly sick bird in their yard in this just pose. I've made sure that while Carmen always has some shade in her aviary, she also has a couple of places she can get direct sunlight at certain times of the day, so she can sun herself when she wants and needs to. But as per usual, she prefers company, and so she would rather sun on my shoulder, or on my arm, or on top of my head, just barely balancing on the tips of her outstretched wings. I marvel at the individual perfection of her feathers, all lifted one by one in this singular, stunning ritual. And though Carmen sunbathes almost every day, I never stop wondering over the wild strangeness of it. Carmen's water baths take almost as long and are even more trouble for me. I don't leave a dish of bath water in her aviary because her splashing would make a mess with the bird waste and the newspapers that line the floor. If I put a bowl in the sink, she will ignore it and stay on my shoulder. She wants me to hold the bowl for her. Baths are good for her, so I give in. Every day I hold her favorite turquoise Fiesta-ware bowl under the tap and let a thin stream of water fall and collect in the dish. Carmen jumps in and out several times, hopping from my wrist to the bowl, ducking her head and fluffing her wings over and over, and splashing water all around the kitchen for as long as 10 minutes. If I don't wear a raincoat, I have to change my soaking wet clothes after. This might be a bit inconvenient some days, but it's also fun, and Carmen clearly loves her bath. After she finishes, she leaps onto my shoulder and shakes like a dog, filling my ear with water, then flies straight over to her aviary and is not the tiniest bit interested in coming out again for at least a couple of hours. She's busy preening every single freshly cleaned feather. When Carmen first feathered out, I thought I might have to teach her to take baths, to coax her into the water, maybe drizzle water over her head to inspire the ducking motion I'd seen in wild starlings during their walks, their sidewalk puddle baths. After all, I'd had to teach Claire to trust water and to wash her own hair when she was a toddler. Perhaps young starlings learn to bathe by watching other starlings. Yet it turns out that the duck-lipped flap splash motion is in her blood, and almost the second Carmen feathered out, she attempted to bathe in my water glass while I was trying to drink from it. Like sunning, water baths are entirely innate, but I was soon to discover proof of an even deeper inborn wildness. One day, Carmen was hanging out in her aviary on a branch by the window. All of a sudden, a Cooper's hawk perched briefly in the big camellia tree just outside, then threw himself, feet forward, into Carmen's closed window, talons aimed at her breast. Now many birds flit at Carmen's window. There are chickadees, bush tits, house finches, and hummingbirds. Some of them, like crows, are almost as big as the Cooper's hawk. She observes them with a curious eye. Sometimes she will hop over for a closer look. Sometimes she will hop away and watch them, wondering, from a distance. This day, when a bird-eating predator she had never seen in her life came at her window, she let out a shriek I did not know she was capable of and hurled herself across the room and onto my shoulder, where she spent the next 15 minutes panting and, another behavior I'd never witnessed, shivering. The Cooper's hawk banged against the window a couple more times. Because he was flying from the nearby camellia, he was unable to get up much speed and was not at all injured, but he did appear to be exceedingly put out. He sat peering in from his perch among the pink flowers for 2 hours. Meanwhile, I had this suddenly wild bird on my shoulder who, in her own mind, had just narrowly escaped death. There was a feral intelligence I hadn't been certain she possessed. But such evolved and wild knowing runs through blood, heart, and imagination. In birds, in each of us. When I set out to follow the story of Mozart and his Starling, I saw at its center a shining, irresistible paradox. One of the greatest and most loved composers in all of history was inspired by a common, despised starling. Now I muse upon the many facets of this tale, and it is wonderful, yes, even more wonderful than I had imagined. But looking back at the trail that I have wandered with these kindred birds, one in history and one in my home, I see also that, as both humans and birds so often are, I've been tricked by my attraction to the shiny little object. For in the end, it is not the exceptionality of this story that is true wonder. It is its ordinariness. In the creatures that intertwine with our lives, those we see daily and those that watch us from urban and wild places, from between branches and beneath leaves and under eaves and stairwells and culverts and sides of walks and pathways, we share everything. We share breath and biology and blood. We share our needs for food and water and shelter. We share the imperative to mate and to give new life and to keep our young safe and warm and fed. We share susceptibility to disease and the potential to suffer an inevitable frailty in the face of these things. We share a certain death. We share everything, constantly, every moment of every day and night, across eons. And in this shared earthly living, when we give our attention to it, we find the basis of our compassion and our empathy for other creatures. And yet we have so much more in common than these of the body needs. We all poop, yes, but we all ponder too. Wondrous. In a manner that may or may not be human, but is whole and wondrous. We are at every moment surrounded by consciousness, a feast of unique intelligences. Every creature has its particular ways and wiles. Each being has its own presence, voice, silence, song, body, place. We are bound by our sameness and our uniqueness in equal measure. Both spring from our shared being on a vital, conscious earth. This is a wild communion, And it is in this recognition that we move beyond simple compassion to a more certain, more essential sense of relatedness, of kinship. Mozart felt this. I know. Like me, he was drawn at first to the shiny thing. In this case, it was stars singing back to him the song he himself had written. But in his elegy poem, we see that a different relationship evolved. The bird's mimicry is not once mentioned. This is a poem to a kindred creature whose presence brought play, sound, song, joy, and friendliness to the maestro's life. And in the work that Starr inspired, this is what we see too. A shared sense of mischief, music, and delight. The word kinship comes from Old English, of the same kind, and therefore related. Kindly and kindness also grow from this root, being toward others that bearing toward others that kinship inspires. I have always thought of all creatures, all organisms really, as relations, whether wandering alone in deep wilderness or just leaning against a tree growling beside an urban sidewalk. I have had no difficulty feeling, as if in dream time, the roots of our relatedness. Ecologically, yes, but also with an overlay of the sacred, the holy. Starlings, though pretty, were a rift in this vision. They fluttered outside this wholeness. But my thinking has evolved. Ecologically, it is true. Starlings do not belong in this country, this city. But relationally, it's not true. We live together in a tangled complexity. I listen to the starlings mimic back to me my own profound ecological shortcomings. Carmen is a creature with a body, voice, and consciousness in the world. In this, we are sisters. And all these unwelcome starlings on the grassy parking strip, yes, they are my relations too. The Cartesian belief in an absolute separatedness of lives, bodies, and brains maintains a foothold in the traditions of our modern culture. We see it in the ways that we are pitted against one another in commerce, in education, and in the small daily jealousies of our own minds. We see it in the ways that we continue to find it culturally acceptable to diminish animals in agriculture, in entertainment, and in scientific experimentation. And yet, when we are attentive, we find that we are not separate, not alone. We are not isolated little minds wandering on a large and indifferent earth. We are surrounded by our kin, by all life, beings with whom we are wayfarers together. Instead of walking upon, we walk within. And this withness brings our imaginations to life. We are inspired, literally breathed upon, together. Our creativity and our connection to other beings is tangled in a beautiful etymology. The words creative and creature spring from the same Latin root creare, to produce, to grow, to bring into existence. It was Ged, Ursula Le Guin's beloved young wizard of Earthsia, who learned after the fall of his individual pride, that the wise person is one who never sets himself apart from other living things, whether they have speech or not. And in later years, he strove long to learn that what can be learned in silence from the eyes of animals, the flight of birds, the great slow of gestures of trees. Through such understanding, we arrive at a new wholeness. We become more receptive and free in body and in imagination. And our unique potential for creative magnificence is enlivened. We become the glistening artists of our own lives and culture. And though, as Mozart learned with Starr and I learned with Carmen, it is natural to come up into attentive communion through the individual creatures before us, this bird, this raccoon, this tree, for we are learning that trees have their own systems of communication and knowing. These individuals are not ends in themselves, but a kind of window into the totality of existence. I waited so eagerly for Carmen to mimic back the concerto's motif. Now I see that she's been calling out something much bigger, much more vital. She has been singing back the song of life, of life, all the time. It's a wonderful chapter. So that is the end of chapter 8, Birds of a Feather. And we will pick up on chapter 9, Mozart's Ear and the Music of the Spheres. And then we've got the finale. So we're just about done with this book. This is Mozart Starling by Leonda Lynn Haupt. Thank you so much for listening. I am Nalani Brown, and we will see you next time.